Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Barr. I am the Associate Director of Career Development with the Schar School of Policy and Government. And today we're going to be talking about, let's see, there. And I believe, yes, you should be able to see the um, presentation. And today we're going to be talking about tips for obtaining a security clearance. Now, a lot of this stuff is not necessarily, obviously, a guarantee that by going to this program or attending this event, you will then be able to get security clearance without issue. The main thing that this is designed to do is give you some kind of tips to help you as you kind of navigate this process, which some slash many have defined as complex. And so what we'll be going over today is just kind of like what the components of the security clearance process are, kind of what this all means for you, and typically just kind of some of the things you can do to help place yourself at an advantage in terms of getting all these materials in at a kind of reasonable time frame. Okay. So first thing, just going to define what is security clearance. So I'm sure everybody on this call pretty much knows kind of what the typical kind of general definition of security clearance is, but just to kind of put it out there, it provides authorization for access to sensitive security or national information. And so it is required for federal or private sector jobs that involve some degree of classified information. And so you can imagine this would be any kind of contractors, obviously different kind of military, different establishments, as well as what you can assume would be like the FBI, Department of State, CIA, NSA, a lot of the three-letter agencies. And so it comes in three different forms, and we'll say 3.5 or 3 asterisk. So the first one is confidential, requires reinvestigation every 15 years. There's the lowest level of security clearance and typically is going to be for kind of like public information, or sorry, non-public information. And so the next form is going to be secret, which requires reinvestigation every 10 years, and then top secret, which requires reinvestigation every 5 years. Now, with top secret, there could also be an SCI, a sensitive compartmented information, which it basically gets added on to the clearance. And so if that has any kind of specific proprietary necessity to the specific information that you're going to be overseeing in that position, think like if you are doing risk analysis or risk assessment for foreign diplomats as they're kind of attending a specific area, since a sensitive compartmented information component to that might be regarding specific security information regarding that specific nation, the diplomat's nation, a number of other kind of scenarios that would have the interaction between those different parties. And so that's just kind of like the general sense of what SCI could mean. It could mean literally, well, not literally, it could mean almost anything. And so for the most part, it is designed to provide an extra layer of security on that top secret kind of level position. And what you might find is that on some applications that you're applying to, that this would be considered, you'll see TS SCI level clearance required or must have the ability to get TS SCI level clearance. And so that's what you would likely see it as in a lot of different applications, regardless of whether that is, a federal position, a contractor position, or within the military. Okay. So the overall timeline you can expect with most investigation processes are this. And so this is a very general timeline. And so it is not necessarily meaning that you will exclusively have 120 days of an average. There have been some people who, given their background and given the international aspects of that background, that has been much longer than, not much longer. It is, well, okay. So to define that, I have seen this process go as long as 2 years, and that is a very special circumstance. I've also seen this process go 3 months. And so for the most part, it is not uncommon for this process to take somewhere between 6 to 9 months. But 120 days being a general average, being one without any kind of issues, any kind of specific callbacks. And by issues, I know I use a very vague term there. Issues being in terms of whether or not the interviewers are able to secure the interviews in a timely manner, whether there's any kind of errors or any kind of issues with the documents that you've submitted. In terms of issues in that sense, I mean errors or misspellings or incorrect addresses, different things like that, or a missed page. It can sometimes happen. The SF-86, Standard Form 86, is a very long document. And so it's not uncommon for somebody to miss a single page, especially if they're printing this out or if they're going through a virtual document, you forgot where you were, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so it all starts with completing the paperwork, not putting the cart before the horse here. It all starts with applicant completing their paperwork, and that is Standard Form 86. This is predominantly occurring online these days through a website called eKIP. The actual address is quite long and has many different dashes and forward slashes and so on and so forth. So my general suggestion is if you're interested in finding the eKIP website, type in e-kip, QIP, into your Google search bar or Bing or whatever you're using, and then hit enter. And then it's generally speaking going to be the first thing you see. If you get there, it will have a whole bunch of information regarding eKIP, which the next slide we're going to be talking about is going to talk more about this at length. But so again, not putting the cart before the horse. You're going to complete the SF-86 through the eKIP process. And that is essentially the questionnaires for investigations processing. There are going to be some times where you would fill this out in hard copy, although I don't necessarily recommend it because smudging and different kind of like handwriting issues, legibility becomes kind of a concern. So for the most part, eKIP is a much more thorough and just, you could say simple in some versions of that definition is how this would apply. Okay, so once you filled out and submitted the paperwork, you are going to then go to a General Services Administration where they're going to verify the information. So your fingerprints are going to get taken, which overwhelmingly is done digitally these days. If you end up getting your fingerprints taken at, say, a police station or anything like that, which a lot of the different police stations around the area, especially if they're in metropolitan areas, are going to have digital fingerprinting methods. But if they do use the ink methodology, like they did my hometown when I was applying for AmeriCorps, which I had my fingerprints taken for that, then they're going to use the ink process more than likely. And so if that is the case, which I had a hometown about like 5,000 less people, that's kind of like the size police station I was kind of working with. But in that case, essentially, you're going to take that. Just want to make sure that your fingerprints don't have any smudges on it, that there's no issue with that part of the process, just so that they don't necessarily kick that back and say, hey, this is inaccurate or this is invalid or invalid. And then paperwork is going to be checked for completeness. And so you're going to have somebody who's going to help walk you through this process, who is going to essentially, once you've received that position offer contingent upon successful clearance process, you're going to have somebody who's going to basically walk you through this investigative process. And so if there is, say, an error, or if there's a missing page, or if there's any kind of thing that's incomplete on that document, or information that isn't necessarily as thorough as it needs to be, this person is going to contact you and say, hey, this is the issue we found with your paperwork. And so there are going to be some different kind of protections so that it doesn't get like 120 days into the process only for them to find out, hey, you missed putting an apostrophe here. I mean, that's a very extreme example, and they likely wouldn't be like, oh, your punctuation was an error here. But I mean, in this example, it's not like you're going to wait until the very end of the process to find out, hey, you weren't awarded security clearance because you didn't fill out the paperwork right. So generally speaking, they're going to check it for completeness. This sometimes does include that's a part of the investigator process. Okay, so after the agency has verified the information and you filled out the fingerprints and sent those in and all that kind of stuff is looking good, it's going to go to the investigation process. So an investigator conducts interviews, and this is going to be an interview of you. It's going to be of friends, family, employers. And so this is going to be both a written or literal kind of an audio interview process. So this could be over the phone. It could be over a proprietary like Teams platform. It could be over kind of like chat, generally speaking, not chat, but generally speaking, it's going to be interviews of these different individuals. And so this could also include a polygraph depending on the position you're applying for. So polygraph might be required for like an FBI role. It could be a part of the CIA application process. But just be aware that that could be a component of this background or this clearance process. Okay, and so once the investigators have gone through and investigated all these individuals who have significant relationships with you, then it's going to get sent to the adjudicators, who are basically going to cross-check everything and basically make sure all the information that has been collected through the investigations, through your application, through the questionnaires, all that information, and they're going to compare and contrast that to kind of what the agency guidelines are, as well as kind of general federal guidelines are. And so basically, after they have confirmed all that information, adjudicated it, it then gets sent to the agency, and then the agency will notify the applicant whether or not you've been awarded that clearance. So this very long process, there's a lot of, I wouldn't say like pitfalls that can happen. I would say more or less there are a bunch of different speed bumps that can, depending on grade of speed bump, could kind of slow down the process. And so in terms of being able to kind of secure those interviews, in terms of being able to kind of make sure that your documents are filled out fully and without issue, all that kind of information can potentially pause this process. Now, to my knowledge, the hiring freeze within federal government currently has not impacted security clearances that have been processed. I don't believe so. I have not heard of examples yet of that process being disrupted, but it is important to understand that this is a little bit of uncharted territory. The term unprecedented definitely applies here. And so there are going to be some components that could be delayed or paused with the government not being shut down. Typically, that does mean that clearance processes can continue. But there's a whole bunch of different things and factors that could impact this. So keep that in mind, whereas they not necessarily be hiring new federal employees that would require this clearance process currently. If you are involved in a clearance process currently, this shouldn't disrupt that part of the process. So keep that in mind. It is not a cure-all. It does not mean that, hey, you're without any concern here now, or that you should be without any concern here now, or that you should be concerned at all. But just understand that the delays can happen as a result of kind of what happens within federal as well as executive level kind of decisions. There are some exemptions for specific federal positions, depending on kind of like the necessity of them within the role of the federal government as well as national security. So that also kind of impacts whether this process continues, yada, yada, yada. So just some additional tips. You always want to answer all questions of the form to the fullest of your ability. If you forgot something, just contact the security official that is helping process this paperwork, or essentially the person who's going to be kind of like running you through the process. All this information is confidential. Now, with that in mind, if you fill out a PDF version, like an editable PDF version of the SF-86, which you can find online, which I have linked. Yes. Sorry. Everyone. Okay. Apologies. There. So in the chat now, I have put the SF-86. This is a document that you can fill out online. If you choose to do that, understand that you will want to password protect this. This is a lot of personally identifiable information, including things like your social security number, your address, current and past, your driver's license information. So there's a lot of personal identity information. So there's a lot of information you don't necessarily want to fall in the wrong hands. So I would suggest making sure that if you use the PDF to edit and enter information and kind of like track all this data, that you make sure you password protect that. Understand that your current employer may be contacted during this process. So if you have not notified them that you are currently in a tentative hiring process or a tentative offer has been on the table, pending successful clearance process, understand that this may make them aware of that. And so you'll want to, in most cases, you'll want to at least notify once you receive that tentative offer that the supervisor may receive a call from a security clearance process. This is to verify employment. So it's a little bit different than what you would typically find with Well, and so they will ask additional questions in terms of the investigation process, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of kind of the holistic nature of their review. But for the most part, they're going to ask kind of like your trustworthiness, your reliability, your character, kind of ask some questions about your kind of employment with that organization. So this is a whole bunch of stuff that you don't necessarily want to be a surprise to your supervisor or your employer, because if your trustworthiness or character of not letting them know that you have been applying to other positions were just to be kind of thrown onto them or surprise them, then that might affect their appraisal of your trustworthiness, of your character, reliability, loyalty. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind in this process. It's not something you kind of stress out over. And just one other kind of note, this is something that might seem pretty obvious, but kick myself if I didn't mention it. The employer is going to request, sorry, the federal department that's hiring you is going to request clearance based on the level of the position, not necessarily just kind of like, you're applying for clearance, can you get the highest one possible? If the requirement is for confidential public trust, then for the most part, they're just going to say, oh, okay. So public trust, you're not going to get TSSCI for this. Whereas if it's TSSCI, then they're going to apply for TSSCI. Okay, cool. Oops. Okay, so this is the eKIP form I was mentioning before. Like I said, I would just go into the Google search bar, and I would just, or Bing, whatever you use, ask Jeeves or ask.com, I guess now. Jeeves is no longer involved. What I would suggest is going to whatever search bar, whatever browser you use, type in e-kip, QIP, and it will bring you directly to the page. The nbib.opm.gov/ekip background investigations is another part of what you can see on the page here, Defense Counterintelligence Security Agency, which processes this eKIP form and other kind of data things. And then on the left toolbar, you can see there being a whole bunch of different pages and information that will help kind of explain and kind of like describe a lot of the parts of this process. So I would suggest looking at that page and just kind of perusing it a little bit, finding out a little bit more about what this process looks like, especially if you're currently looking at or in the interview process for a security clearance level position. This will help you kind of, navigate the process a little bit more effectively. And if there are any questions, thoughts, or concerns with whatever security clearance descriptions I'm providing, or you would like me to elaborate on anything, you can always feel free to, at the end of this, ask your questions. You can unmute and ask your questions. Otherwise, you can always feel free to enter stuff into the chat, and we'll handle it from there. All right. Any elaboration on the polygraph portion? Other than, effectively, it may be a component. I've had some students in the past who have applied for positions that a polygraph was required for them. Essentially, if you fail the polygraph, you are going to be ejected from the program. Ejected is really kind of an intense way to put that. If you receive a fail response to the polygraph, you are removed from the application process, essentially the clearance process. Now, there are two other likelihoods that can happen. You pass or you get inconclusive results. Inconclusive results basically make it so that you have to take the test again. If you get inconclusive again, then effectively you are removed from the process, but you're not blacklisted from the position. If you fail a polygraph test, you can be blacklisted from that position or that agency. And so that's just one of the kind of, I think, not concerns. That is one of the things to keep in mind about the polygraph portion. But essentially, this entire process to evaluate your trustworthiness, your character, your loyalty, and specifically your I'm going to go back to the other page here because there's one I'm forgetting. Loyalty, character, trustworthiness, and reliability. Reliably not able to come up with that information is ironic. But the general idea here is there is going to be some there are going to be some positions. Sorry. There are going to be some different positions that will require a a polygraph in this part of the process. I think the thing to keep in mind is up until you see in the application that it says polygraph may be required or polygraph required. And this would be in like the how to apply or application materials, different things like that. It will notify you what parts of this process will be involved. So that's just, keep that kind of stuff in mind. Don't necessarily focus on that exclusively, is I guess what I would suggest. Does that answer your question? Yes, perfect. Okay. So now we're just going to go into the different areas of the investigation. And so this is going to be a number of different things. The entire thing I would keep in mind with this in terms of the areas of investigation is that this is holistic. It isn't necessarily one thing overcomes all. Like if your foreign influence and preference, if there was one thing that happened in your background that was the absolute best thing that could happen in terms of you were able to display extreme loyalty to your country, yada yada yada. It doesn't excuse if there's issues of like financial history, like if you bought $1 million home but you don't afford a mortgage of 300,000. So it isn't necessarily going to be taking like one thing over others. It's going to be taking kind of both of those things into mind before kind of deciding on kind of like what your fate of security clearance would be. So in this case, foreign influence and preference is really kind of looking at foreign contacts, as well as kind of what degree those relationships could influence or your preference for those specific foreign contacts could, affect your decision or work ability within the specific agency or department that you would be applying to. And so they review foreign contacts, foreign travel, dual citizenships. There are going to be some agencies that will require you to renounce dual citizenships, depending on kind of like, what those dual citizenships are, as well as just basically making sure that essentially you have one sole citizenship to whatever country, in this case, the US. And so that may be a component to kind of like, applying or receiving a security clearance. In terms of foreign contacts, this would not necessarily be like you had an excellent conversation with somebody at a coffee table in Munich. This would be individuals you are on first name basis relationships with. It could be a roommate from a study abroad. It could be you have cousins who are living in Ireland currently. It could be that degree of kind of like foreign contact. But what I would define this as is significant relationships, individuals that you have kind of a frequent conversational relationship with that you are currently kind of aware of. If it is kind of that roommate scenario, you haven't talked to them for like years, but you spent every day together for these 3 to 4 months that you were studying abroad in whatever country. That is likely going to be a name they want to know. They might want to be able to try to get into contact with that person. If you do not have that contact information before anymore because you have not talked to that person since, then for the most part, I wouldn't worry too much about it. That said, if you are able to get into contact with that person through like a Facebook connection or any other kind of thing, what I would do is try to ask that person for their contact information, as you might need them to provide reference, or they might need to be investigated by investigators for whatever part of this process. But it's also within reason. So if they're not actively using that Facebook account anymore and you're having trouble getting a hold of them, if you have no way to visibly or reliably get that information, then it's out of your control. You're not able to really kind of fulfill that kind of relational communication process. Foreign travel, for the okay, Sanam, I will get to your question in just one second. So I think there are some individuals that would view this foreign influence or preference as kind of like a little bit of a double-edged sword. Like, the fact that you have these relations might, or have these kind of foreign contacts, have all this travel experience, might have dual citizenship, they might see that as a bit of a burden because that might prolong the process. The other advantage of this is that foreign language and international experience can be major assets. Like I was talking at the beginning of this, that TSSCI, sensitive compartmentative um, uh, information, could be especially like, we need you to specifically keep in mind this nation's specific security issues. If you have that experience, if you have that background, that you would be able to kind of like understand the culture, understand kind of the influences on that culture, yada, 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 then for the most part, that could be a significant advantage in the interview process as well as the application process. So it is not necessarily something to shy away from as you're kind of going through and building your experience towards the kind of level of positions. It's just something to kind of keep in mind that, this one can prolong the process, but I would not define it as a disadvantage in any sense of the word. Okay. If my parents live in China and I have semi-regular contact with them and they have no government ties to Chinese officials, will this affect my getting security clearance? That's kind of a difficult question to answer. Will this affect getting a security clearance? It's certainly, they're going to want to contact them and interview them, because they're going to need to identify what's the nature of their kind of living abroad, and and kind of like, even if you're not having kind of like daily communication with them, semi-regular is still semi-regular. So you are going to be communicating with them and with those individuals on a semi-frequent basis. So will it affect the process? Certainly, because they are going to need to interview those individuals, and they are going to likely need to kind of get a sense of kind of like what influence they might have over your decisions within the security within the government. Whether or not that would dictate you get or do not receive a security clearance is anyone's guess. So I would say it is not like a silver bullet to your application. But I mean, it is something that they will likely take into context as they're making their decision. I know that's a very vague answer, but it's a lot of this is kind of presumptive in nature in terms of assuming what they will care about in that overall security clearance process. So, but what I would say is that it's not necessarily going to dictate that you will never receive a security clearance. What it might be is that they just need to prolong that part of the process. Like, for instance, my friend who had 2-year long security clearance process. Part of the issue was they weren't able to get into contact with that person's mom who lived currently in Iran. And so it was less of an issue of that person not being forthcoming and more of an issue of not being able to get into contact with that person and schedule an interview. And so it will affect the overall process, but whether or not it affects whether or not you get the clearance, it's hard to say based on kind of like what their responses are and kind of like what that part of the process will be. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay, so foreign influence and preference is not necessarily a killer to any application, and honestly can be a pretty significant advantage. My friend who applied was applying for a Department of State position, and so in having kind of Arabic language skills as well as Spanish language skills was significantly advantageous to them getting a position within the Department of State, quantifiably an advantage. And so keep that kind of stuff in mind. Now, criminal behavior and drug use, obviously, there's going to be some pretty obvious components to this kind of part of the investigation. You want to be knowledgeable about any agency-specific policies regarding past drug use. So if it's like a Schedule 1 drug and you've had significant use of that Schedule 1 drug, then it is likely that you will not be awarded security clearance based on that drug use history. Now, it does depend on the frequency as well as we'll say the significance or severity, we'll say, of the drug use or criminal behavior. If there was a DUI when you were 17, and you're currently 35, and there's never been an issue since, then for the most part, they will not likely look at that as this has been an infrequent behavior, therefore this is how he will act forever. So the severity and the frequency of these behaviors are going to be taken into context. So I've worked with a number of different students. Some have had marijuana charges when they were minors, and they've been expunged from their background. And now the thing is, if you had a marijuana charge, a non-felonious marijuana charge, when you were a minor, and that's been quote unquote expunged from your background or your record, if you do not disclose that information to the federal government during the security clearance process, they will likely find out about it. So it is very important to make sure that you're as open and honest as possible, especially regarding something that may have been expunged from your background, but might still be around in some specific state information or data set system. So just keep that in mind. Again, the severity and frequency of these behaviors is taken into context. If you if you have lost your license because of multiple DUI arrests, then that is going to be a frequent and severe consequence to a specific behavior. And so that is something to kind of keep in mind that could prevent you from receiving a security clearance. But again, the frequency is a very important component because they're trying to figure out, whether this person is trustworthy, and whether or not there's a consistent standard of behavior. Okay, so going from that to alcohol use and abuse, same kind of thing. If you're an individual who has multiple DUIs, then that is going to be considered alcohol abuse. Now, if you are an individual who's involved in Alcoholics Anonymous or anything like that, then it is important to understand that, in this case, you don't necessarily have to disclose that, yes, I'm involved in this or I'm sober this many years or anything like that. But for the most part, they if that is the response to issues with alcohol abuse in the past, then that might be helpful in the investigator's eyes. That might be seen as kind of an assistance in whether or not this is going to be consistent behavior or if there are going to be concerns down the road regarding abuse standards. So keep that in mind that alcohol use and abuse, it can influence your application, but whether or not, again, this is a very holistic part of the process. So alcohol use in its standard format, as long as it's not being abused, is not going to hurt you in this application process. But it is important to keep in mind that if you are spending most weekends, drinking to, a point of inebriation that is unhealthy, then that is also going to be taken into context within this process, this investigation. Now, financial history is a little bit more complex than some of the others. In cases of alcohol use and abuse or criminal behavior, that's a fairly black and white kind of distinction, right? Now, with financial history, the vast majority of adults will have some degree of debt. There are very few people out there who are entirely debt-free. And so what they're reviewing here is more or less, is your debt-to-income ratio outrageous? And so most people are going to have student loans. A lot of people will have specifically like mortgages, they will have car payments, they will have some degree of debt. And so what they are really looking at here is the debt-to-income ratio predominantly in the debt scale versus the income scale. So if, like my example earlier, you have bought a home worth like $1.2 million on a salary of $60,000 a year, then they're going to look at your kind of financial decisions and kind of call into question whether or not they are at risk for being bribed, if they are at risk for essentially their poor financial decisions. And again, this is a very holistic part of the process. And so they are not going to look at your student loans and say, oh, wow, $70,000 for student loans. And, their rent is $2,000 a month, and they're currently working on a student salary or a $60,000 a year job, and think, yeah, there's no way they can do that. Again, this is very holistic. So they're going to take a look at all those different components and say, okay, within reason, they have this many roommates, they have this part of the process, they're going to have to do this, this, and this. And so they're going to be realistic as regards some of this kind of stuff. So, so the main reason I go into this much context regarding financial history is that don't stress out about it too much. Everybody has some degree of debt. It's whether or not you are making good financial decisions at the time. So yeah. throw that out there. Okay. Disciplinary record. And so the way this will differ from things like criminal behavior and kind of like drug use is this is kind of in a less severe route, right? So this looks at kind of like the trustworthiness and moral character of have you been consistently written up at work for, being cruel or mean to whatever patrons that you work for or you serve. And so in the context, I used to work at Best Buy, right? Now, if I greeted everybody with a derogatory statement and was just absolutely mean to everybody who walked into the store, I probably wouldn't have a job there for very long unless they really, really liked me for some reason. But if that is kind of going to be a component of the review of the investigation, that could affect the investigate. That could affect whether or not I get this position. So they're going to look at things like, are they able to get into work consistently on time? Have you had to write them up ever, or any kind of degree of consistency with writing them up? How do they work with their colleagues? Are they collegial? They're going to look at kind of like the disciplinary record in that sense. And so it's not necessarily just an absence of issue. It's more or less kind of like, what is their work methodology? What is their are they hard workers? They're going to look at kind of like not necessarily just your disciplinary record, but how do you act within an office, or how do you act within your specific community, your friends, your home, your neighborhood, things like that. Mental health and physical health exams may be required. So depending on kind of what agency or what organization you're applying to, this could have an impact on whether or not they require physical health exams. For instance, Department of State for Foreign Service Officers, depending on where they send you out to, or sorry, not just depending, they will require you to go through a health exam, a physical exam. Because they are not able to really send you out to anywhere that is unable to get whatever medications that you might need. Then that is going to be a very important component to whether or not they send you to those locations, right? They can't send you if you're a diabetic person. If you're a person with diabetes, they can't send you to a place that you're not able to get insulin. And so, for the most part, that is going to be what they're looking for with physical health exams. With mental health, they're going to look you're obviously at your psychology and the degree to which you're going to need to you might need additional assistance, or if there's any kind of specific challenges that you might be facing or anything like that. And so this is essentially you'd be working with a therapist who would be doing an evaluation, psychiatric evaluation, and determining your mental fitness for specifically whatever position you'd be going into. That may be required for some positions. It is not requirement for every position, if that makes sense. And again, we're looking at the whole person in this sense, the holistic perspective of who you are. So the age of this behavior, the recency of this behavior, the consistency, the frequency, if you will, of the behavior, and the severity of those behaviors are all going to be taken into context before they kind of say tantamount, hey, this person did one thing bad 18 years ago, therefore they're a terrible person. So try not to concern yourself with the fact that you might have something in your deep history or something happened 10 years ago that I still kind of wake up with, or it just makes me have that awkward flash or whatever, anything like that. But keep all that kind of stuff in mind. It's not necessarily like, hey, one thing happened that for the security clearance process is just never going to work out for you. They are going to take a lot of the stuff into context and again look at the whole person. Okay, so just some tips for kind of a smooth process. Review the SF-86 before you have to fill it out. So if you're not currently in a security clearance process, I would suggest going to the link I posted in the chat here, looking up to see whether or not, or just looking at it and kind of reviewing it, seeing what you might have to enter in there. If you don't have some of the information that you find in there, get it. So for the most part, if they're like, hey, we need to know where you've lived for the past 7 to 10 years, which for a lot of college students, for a lot of people in grad school, it's maybe less of a concern, but you will still be likely moving in a semi-frequent basis. So making sure that you have the addresses for each one of those different locations so that you can provide that information in this form is going to be very helpful. I suggest collecting it for the past 10 years, just because if they only require 7 years, you're going to be, well set to make sure that it's like, okay, well, I moved when, I was, I moved at 31, I'm 38 now. But I can't remember if that was like 7 years ago or if that was 8 years ago. So just keep that in mind. And then you're also going to want to keep a record of contact information and addresses of the last 7 to 10 years. So if you had a building manager, your landlord, or if it was for like a university or in university housing, keep in mind that you would likely put the Office of Residence Life or whatever university's Office of Residence Life, whatever they call it, that's what you'd put there. Document all foreign travel and foreign contacts. Like I said, this is going to be significant contacts, individuals that you will have a consistent relationship with. So if it's that person that you studied abroad with that you have not talked to since you concluded that program, that might be somebody they want to try to contact. But if you don't have any way to contact them, then don't necessarily concern yourself with kind of like becoming an internet sleuth and figuring out what happened to them. For the most part, no one's going to harsh your vibes in this case if you're not able to come up with every single contact you had with every international trip. Now, so in terms of foreign travel, this would be like, say, I took a weekend to go to Ireland, like an extended weekend. That's the kind of thing you want to document. Like you went to this place at this time, that kind of stuff. Now, I would not include the foreign contacts of like the Airbnb I stayed at or the hotel I went to. That's not necessarily the degree to which you need to or memorize those foreign contacts. But say it was a week-long study abroad, and the person who was operating the study abroad office or the international office of that study abroad, that person, like, you developed a really strong relationship with, they ended up becoming a mentor, started talking to you and providing assistance for ideas on how to work in those countries, so on and so forth. That would be kind of the significant contact I would consider adding. But say it's the person who kind of operated that, you never really talked to them outside the context of your coursework, that's not what I would consider a significant contact. Because, I mean, for the most part, would they be able to pick you up out of a lineup, considering they do this program on a daily basis for years on end? So keep that stuff in mind. Make sure you submit the paperwork in a timely manner. You don't necessarily want to delay this stuff because the further you delay it, the less likely it will be completed in a timely manner. That is the process overall. So try to, if you can, fill out the SF-86 to begin with, just so that it becomes a very simple process of cutting and pasting or just submitting the SF-86 PDF for their review, and as soon as you're able to. This will help kind of alleviate the pressure of, oh, well, I need to get this information now, I don't have it, yada, yada, yada. Ensure package is complete, including properly rolled fingerprints if required. Digital fingerprinting is very advanced. And so if they, get that fingerprint back and they're like, oh, it's inconclusive, it didn't necessarily track it correctly, they'll just do it again. And so for the most part, it's pretty simple. But if it is an ink rolled fingerprint process, make sure that there's no smudging. Make sure that when they put it into the paper, it didn't stick up to the top of the paper. It wasn't too inky of a roll. Then make sure that you're not missing out on the overall process. Okay, so if you're a male, make sure that you've registered for Selective Service. It's a fairly simple process. If you have not, or if you have heard of Selective Service, make sure you go online, type in Selective Service USA, and then that will take you likely to the specific website that you'll need to. Sorry. I have a link here, but it's not letting me copy it. So, but type Selective Service into the search bar and it will likely pull it up for you. And essentially that just, if there is a draft, that would give you your draft number, if you will. So some additional things to keep in mind: provide any extra records as required, financial records, etc. So this would be like if you had a private loan that you used for school, that would not necessarily be a part of whatever review process. So like studentaid.gov would not have record of this. Then make sure that you include that as a part of the overall kind of like documentation of additional kind of like financial information. Consider an internship or a co-op that requires clearance. Now, these clearances are not, they are temporary clearances. So you might get a, proprietary clearance for whatever term of the internship. But what this will mean for you is that effectively it will show that you can complete and get a security clearance. So it will allow you to kind of go through that process and be able to kind of, make sure that you get involved in being able to, it will make sure, it will make sure that you can showcase your ability to pass a clearance process, which is very advantageous, a very marketable kind of component to this, but you will not have, say, a TSSCI level internship clearance that you can then use to apply to, already has, TSSCI clearance positions. Be accurate and honest. Obviously you don't want to lie in this form because that's an easy way to make sure that you don't get your clearance. But for the most part, be as accurate as you can and be as honest as possible. If there is, say, like that misdemeanor drug charge when you were a minor that has been expunged from your record, just be honest in part of the process and say, I had this drug charge. I was a minor. It's been expunged. I've never had another instance of that behavior. Just to make sure that, they are aware so that they don't find this stuff out and then have to ask you, why were you hiding this information? Follow up after 30 days if you have not been contacted. You're not bothering the person as long as you're not submitting an email that's 10 paragraphs long. Typically, my suggestion would be to contact them saying, hey, I'm just following up on kind of where I'm at in the process. Thank you. That's as simple as it needs to be. You don't necessarily need to provide additional context unless it is necessary. Like, hey, I forgot I did not add this specific document, or I realized I did not fill out this specific thing. If that's part of the process, or if that's something that did happen, like you forgot about it, make sure you send that to them. But if you're just following up on where you were at in the process, all you need to do is ask that one simple sentence of, hey, I just wanted to follow up on where I'm at in the security clearance process. Thank you. And that's it. All right. So there we go. So that has been tips for obtaining a security clearance, the webinar. My name is Brian Barr. I'm the Associate Director of Career Development with the Charter School of Policy and Government. If you have any questions or if you have any thoughts on kind of going through your own security clearance process, or you'd like to set up a meeting with me to discuss your career search, your resume, your cover letter, do a mock interview, any of these different kind of resources are available to you. You can feel free to contact me on the information that is here. And so thank you so much. And yeah, please do let me know if you have any questions.